Hi everyone, I'm back from spending 3 wonderful weeks in India and I have an updated version of what yoga is like in India today. So let's get to it.
Hi everyone, I'm Arundhati and you've just tuned in to the Let's Talk Yoga podcast, your ultimate online destination for learning about yoga. Whether you're a seasoned yoga teacher or a curious yoga student, there's something for you here. Let this podcast be your virtual yoga school. We offer insights, inspiration, and loads of nerdy exploration of yoga along the way. But first, who am I? I'm an Indian immigrant yoga teacher living in America for the past decade. I have my own yoga school here in Seattle, and I'm also a Bollywood choreographer, and I've nurtured a thriving yoga community at my studio, as well as a global yoga audience through my courses and this podcast. Through this podcast, I intend to create a space for you, the yoga student and yoga teacher, to learn about yoga in depth. Think of this as your online yoga school, free teacher training coming to you every week. So grab your cup of chai and let's jump in.
If you remember, in 2012, I wrote a blog post. In fact, it was the first blog post I ever wrote, and it was about the differences between yoga in India versus yoga in America. Little did I know that that blog would go viral overnight. And this was when going viral and being on trend weren't concepts we heard of every day. Today, the landscape is different because of how social media works, and going viral is something that happens literally every day, many times over. But back in the day, you rarely saw a yoga blog go viral. And it took me by surprise because I was not qualified to write about yoga. And the only thing I thought I could write about was yoga in India versus yoga in America. And it was 2012. So I had just moved and I was trying to figure out how to teach yoga here. I also made a podcast episode about it. I think it's episode 2. So you'll have to scroll all the way back. And I just shared my naive observances of what was different in 2012 for yoga in India versus yoga in America. Now, why am I telling you this? Because 13 years later, I am doing an updated version of it. So on this episode, I will be sharing my observations of what yoga is like in India today from 2012 to 2025. But before that, if you are curious to read that old blog post or listen to that podcast, I will link both of those in the show notes as well as in the podcast description. Now, getting back to the episode, I went to India after 6 years. Now, 6 years is a long time. Typically, most Indian people that I know will go back every year or every other year. The last time I went to India was 2019, right before the pandemic hit. It was the year my mother passed. And since then, for some reason or the other, I have not been able to go back. So I was very excited to be back in India, and I had honestly forgotten how wonderful India feels for my soul. Meeting my friends, I even got to meet my yoga teacher after 12 years. If you follow me on Instagram, I shared all my updates. You can see my picture with my teacher, our little story of what it was like. I went back to the school, and it was a wonderful trip. So I have been waiting for many weeks to sit down and record this podcast where I get really nerdy about what yoga is like in India today. And to be honest, I have restarted this recording about 7 times because I'm just full of excitement sharing this with you. Okay? So on the show today, I'm going to share some observations of what yoga is like in 2025. One of the first observations I made is that yoga is everywhere. A decade ago, when I was about to leave India and move to America, a slow revival of yoga was happening. And when I say revival, I'm talking largely about the physical practice of yoga. And unlike America and some other parts of the world, India did not necessarily have yoga studios. And I'm doing air quotes for yoga studios behind the microphone here. In India, we've always had yoga shalas. Now, shala is like a school. It is a place of learning, seeking, and discovering your true nature. A studio is a little more of a commercial setup, and you largely get access to the physical practice of yoga. A shala is a little more transformational in nature, whereas a studio can sometimes feel a little more transactional. Typically, in a shala, you would get to learn deeper layers of yoga, and you would get access to teachers who have spent honestly decades, if not a lifetime, in study. Whereas in studios, you will meet yoga teachers who have been through 200 and 300 courses or some equivalent of those. Okay? In a shala, sometimes you will have people who are parts of lineages or who have spent a lot of time in study of yoga masters and PhDs and things like that. Okay? So one of the biggest surprises to me was that now you will find yoga classes and yoga studios everywhere. When I studied yoga about 14, even 15 years ago, it was very hard to find a yoga class or a yoga teacher near you. So I had to actually leave Bangalore, where I lived, and I had to travel to Mysore to study yoga. I had to stay there as a resident student for many months to learn. But today, I noticed that there is a big shift. Yoga is everywhere. It is literally what I wished yoga was like when I left India. I was wonderfully surprised to see that there was yoga classes, yoga studios pretty much on every street. And I'm not exaggerating. I'm referring to Bangalore. So my observations are specifically to Bangalore city, or Bengaluru as it is called now. And within a minute of where my parents' home was, I could find a handful of classes. And every street, if not every other street, had some form of yoga available. So this revival of yoga was wonderful for me to see. I felt like a kid in a candy store, and I was exploring different yoga classes on my trip as best as I could. Back in the day, it would be so hard for me to find one or two classes. Today, it is effortless. If you followed me on Instagram during my trip, you would see all the different schools I went to. I was sharing my thoughts on a variety of them, and it was just such a wonderful realization. I believe this revival is partly because of International Yoga Day. It also is because of how the economic landscape in India has changed, awareness has changed, and a whole bunch of other things. But today, it is much easier to find a yoga class, a yoga studio in India than a decade ago. The second observation is about the geographical landscape of India. In Bengaluru city, traveling from one part to another part of the city is extremely challenging because of how crowded the city is. And honestly, the development was unplanned and the streets are narrow, and lots of people reside in Bangalore city because it is the Silicon Valley of India. So think of it as LA traffic on steroids. It is very common to take at least 2 hours one way to get to your work. And so people spend 4 hours in commute every day. And the city is choking with too many people. So micro communities have formed where people do not leave the radius of their homes for many things. In India, certain things are very convenient. For example, you can get groceries at your doorstep. Now, this is not something that was born out of the pandemic, like at least in America, some things moved because of the pandemic. It is it has been like this forever. Ever since I remember, groceries can come home. Your milk gets delivered to your doorstep every morning. Your domestic help comes home to help you with your chores. Sometimes they will come twice a day if needed. Kids go to school either in a school van or an auto rickshaw pickup. And a school van is equivalent to a school bus here in America. So literally everybody comes to your doorstep. Rarely do you have to go out for many things. So you can even get a doctor to come home. You can get blood tests to happen at home. You can get a yoga teacher to come home. Parlor services can also come home. So essentially, because of how crowded the city is and how people struggle to get from one point to the other, instead of you going to your services come to you. And it is honestly a very convenient setup. And it's very different from at least life here in America. So why am I telling you this? Because people do not travel too far away to get to a yoga class. Now, for me here in America, it is common for me sometimes to drive to a yoga studio that is an hour away to do a class. But in India, I noticed that people would stay very local to their yoga classes. So if there is a class on your street, people just around that street and within a radius of 5 or 10 minutes would come to that class. So a lot of these small independent businesses have popped up where they have the local community attending their classes. And because it is hard to get from point A to point B. So that was one of the biggest observations. So you'll notice in quantity, a lot of yoga studios in a small area. Here in Redmond, there are about 3 yoga studios across all of Redmond, whereas you would find literally 3 to 5 different classes on my street where my house was. So that was the biggest change in terms of the geographical landscape for yoga in India. My third observation was around yoga studios, their teachers, and the class schedules. Most yoga classes there start very early. In fact, India as a country just wakes up very early. It's partly because of the temperature. It's partly because of how quickly things open and close there. So all classes began at 5:30 a.m. That was a very common thing that you would see. Typically, people will start 5:30 a.m. In fact, when I lived there and taught classes, I would also start at 5:30 a.m. Okay? So you will notice that yoga studios advertise their classes as 5:30 a.m., 6:30 a.m., 7:30 a.m., and then classes went directly in the evening with an occasional midday batch here and there. So classes as per schedule would be either early in the morning. Sometimes you would find a midday class like 10 or 11 a.m. That is typically called the ladies batch because mainly women are in those classes. And then there would be 2 classes in the evening, say 5:30 to 6:30 p.m., 6:30 to 7:30, or 6 to 7 p.m. and 7 to 8 p.m. An interesting observation for me was that all yoga studios and classes were closed on Sundays, which is kind of surprising to me because I would think Sundays is when you will have more time to go to a yoga class. But maybe that's a very American thing. All classes in India were shut on a Sunday. You will find a wide variety of classes today in India. You will find commercial yoga studios that will resemble yoga studios, say, like here in the West, with changing rooms and props, a lobby, social media presence, a front desk, and so on. But you will also find a lot of what I would call rooftop yoga in India. And that happens because space is at a premium. You will notice that people will teach on the top floor of their homes when they have a large room. We would call it a hall in India, or at least in Indian English. They would teach on that top floor of their terrace. They would cover it and they would be teaching on the top floor. So that rooftop yoga is very common, and it also makes yoga very accessible because then you don't have to pay rent and you are running your business from home. Even Bharat Shetty, who I studied with, had converted the top floor of his house into a yoga class, into a yoga studio. And most yoga teachers that I studied with back in the day, the school was the top floor of their homes. Today that has changed. You will find rooftop yoga. You will also find dedicated yoga studios and shalas. It really depends on where you're at. Some common elements that I noticed across studios and shalas is, firstly, you left your belongings outside the yoga room. And this is so refreshing. So no cell phones, no distractions, no extra things walking into the studio with you. Literally, you and your yoga mat would go into the shala. So that is a wonderful way to start your pratyahara before your yoga class begins. Another observation I made was that people would not mention the style of yoga on schedule. For example, you will only see, say, 5:30 a.m. yoga, 6:30 a.m. yoga, 6 p.m. yoga, and you would not necessarily see the type of class or the style of class or even the teacher teaching. And I've always known this about India. In fact, when I moved here, it was very surprising and confusing to me to look at yoga studio schedules here because I was used to something a little more simplified. And you are essentially supposed to go to class and just attend whatever is being offered to you. So a lot of studios there have a detailed programming. I'll give you an example of a studio I went to. Monday would be, say, Hatha Yoga, where you would do yoga without vinyasa. Tuesday would be Iyengar Yoga, yoga with props. Wednesday would be Vinyasa. Thursday would be Yoga Nidra. Friday would be restorative yoga. Saturday morning would be a little bit of everything, but also pranayama included into a longer schedule. So there is more holistic abhyasa, more holistic study of the different parts of yoga. And it's not necessarily about picking a style that makes you most excited and that you like. It is about teaching you wider aspects of what yoga is like. And I honestly believe there are a lot of benefits to this approach and some cons as well. But I noticed this in many yoga classes where the name of the style of asana was left out, the teachers were left out, and you would go there and in many ways surrender yourself to what is being taught. So that was something that kind of caught me by a little bit of surprise because I had forgotten about it. One frustrating observation for me, if I'm being honest, was that a lot of yoga classes there do not have a website, do not have a digital presence, do not have a Instagram account. And it was challenging for me to get in touch with them. In fact, I couldn't go to a few classes that I wanted to just because I didn't have a local number. I couldn't call them to find out what the details of their classes were. So if there is one suggestion I would make to anybody teaching yoga in India is to make sure that you are visible, whether that's a website, whether that's an Instagram presence or your Google listing, to just have that updated so it is easier for people to find you online. And because there's so many micro communities and that community feeds the yoga classes, I understand why the digital space is a little empty, but I just found it a little challenging because I wanted to go to so many yoga classes, but I wasn't able to find the details that I needed to get to those classes. So that's another observation. And one last thing here about yoga studios. I noticed that a lot of teachers do not do this full time. They teach this in the morning or once in the evening, and they have something else that is their main livelihood. And I could be wrong. There are full time teachers, especially in the studio spaces. But a general observation I made was that they continued doing other things in life while also teaching yoga on the side. Someone asked me recently, were there yoga props in every studio? Yes, every single class I went to, there were yoga props and the shalas were clean, well lit, well ventilated. There was drinking water everywhere. It was beautiful. And I had such a wonderful experience. An interesting observation for me was that aerial yoga seems to be on trend right now in India, and everybody seems to be doing aerial yoga. I didn't, but it seems to be something that at least Indian people are very excited about. Another observation I made was chanting is in every class. No matter what style of yoga you end up in, whether it is a yoga class, at a yoga shala or in a westernized yoga studio, there is chanting. And chanting happens before class and also at the end of class. They do 3 ohms and a couple of mantras or prayers that invoke universal peace for you and everyone around you and wishing for everyone to prosper. And it was beautiful to be able to sit and chant in classes before and after practice. And one final observation that I would like to share here. I mean, I have so many different things to share, but one final one I will leave you with because I don't want this episode to get super long is this is from a business owner, studio owner standpoint. You never sign waivers in India, okay? Liability waivers. And I always knew this because I remember it from a decade ago. It still caught me by surprise. You don't sign a waiver. You don't put in an emergency contact. You literally pay for class and just get started. And to me, it was just a signal of there's a lot more fear in America for different reasons. And India is a little more free like that. And I attended 7 different classes, like 7 different studios or shalas, and I didn't sign a waiver anywhere. It was oddly freeing, but also confuses me because I've done yoga in the West for so long. It was just an interesting, quirky observation. And it's pretty much what I have to share with you. There's a wide variety of yoga in India. There is some fantastic yoga available, but there is also some substandard offerings. When yoga is taught in India, there is a lot less spoon feeding. I notice here, at least in America, we tend to over cater sometime and we give less independence to the students. We tell them every single thing. So I believe that there's a lot of talking that happens in modern day yoga classes. India is a little more independent like that. There is fantastic community in these yoga schools I went to. Every yoga shala I went to, there's such beautiful community there. You know, in America, when you walk into a yoga studio, you will find merchandise and things to buy and a shop before you get to the actual practice space. It was such a lovely experience to walk into yoga studios there and find a yoga library, to find yoga books, to not see merchandise, and to just see maybe a statue of Maharishi Patanjali and books that you could sit and read in the lobby. So that was a beautiful reminder of what yoga should be like. I also thought yoga in India, at least where I went, was largely not glamorous, and I found it so free in some ways. It was very familiar to me because that's the kind of yoga in many ways I grew up with. So it was beautiful. I also noticed that people always clean up after themselves, as in they will put the props back. They will leave the shala in a certain way. In America, people will I've seen this in yoga gyms, and I sometimes see it at my studio. People will just dump the props and keep rushing. Whereas there is an etiquette. And one of the teachers who I did class with, she said, how you treat your props is an extension of your yoga, and something to that extent. So community in many ways takes care of the yoga studio. They maintain their student nature till they actually leave the shala, which I found very refreshing. And that's my take on yoga in India today. There is a lot more access to yoga classes, and there are many different yogas available there. And it's a little confusing to navigate, but with a little bit of effort, you can, because you have access to more now than a long time ago. And it was an incredible experience. I have missed India. I have missed doing yoga in India. And I really hope that you followed along these 3 weeks that I was there, and you followed along my studio hopping, as I would call it. And I hope to go back sooner than later. I will be also writing a blog and sharing some recommendations of yoga in India, at least in Bengaluru city. I will do that once my jet lag is a little better. And I'm so glad to be back and to be able to share this with you. I have come back recharged. I have so much that I want to do in the months and weeks ahead, especially when it comes to sharing yoga with you. At this point, I am hiring a new operations and admin assistant for the studio. I know some of you have already applied. Applications, as this episode drops, are still open. So if you want to apply for that, the details are in the show notes. And I would highly encourage that you do that sooner than later, because we will be filling that position soon. So that's pretty much it from my end. I know this episode is a little all over the place. I'm going to blame that on jet lag, but hopefully you got some idea of what yoga is like in India today. And once I am settled back, give me a few days, we will be back to our regular programming for all things on the Let's Talk Yoga podcast. That's it, my friend. I'm happy to be back and to be doing this with you. I will see you next week with another episode. Until then, take care. Bye-bye.